Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. In this episode, I'll be chatting with John Peebles, CEO of Administrate, an enterprise training management platform, about the changing technology landscape that's impacting employees in every type of organization. We'll be chatting today about how to see your digital transformation efforts in a different light. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much for having me.
John, you have a very interesting background that has a pretty heavy healthcare focus at one point. In fact, you've been or you're currently a board member for a firm that provides doctors with in-home health monitoring for patients. And prior to that, you worked as a CIO, creating revenue management solutions for hospitals and healthcare providers. How did you make the transition from the healthcare world into the world of training management?
Yeah, it's a story that starts with a whole lot of pain. And that was when I was the CIO and head of operations for my previous healthcare company, Century Data Systems in South Florida. We were growing really fast. We were making a lot of mistakes like you always do in a startup, but we were getting a lot of things right. And so we had a lot of new customers and a lot of new employees, a lot of new partners that we needed to onboard. And what we did is super detailed, but we processed a lot of pharmacy transactions. So it was highly regulated. It was really important to make sure that everybody understood what was going on. And we couldn't just pluck a pharmacist off the street and say, go do your job. Everybody that walked through our door, whether they were a customer, partner, or employee, had to be trained extensively. And that fell under my responsibility. And it was a heavy classroom training component. Most corporate training, at least the high value stuff today, is still done in a classroom, 80% of it. And just managing all the logistics of what rooms are available and who can teach this and who should be in this class and all this stuff was really difficult. And we never got that problem solved, and it hurt our growth. And I was haunted by that experience when I had the opportunity to look for a new opportunity. And I found this little company that had been founded in the Highlands of Scotland. And they had built a tool to help them solve this problem. And they started getting asked if people could buy it. And so they spun it out and I came on board, and that was 12 years ago. And we're still headquartered here in Edinburgh, but we predominantly sell now to the United States, usually mid to larger sized enterprises, and basically try to help them solve the problem of lack of infrastructure for training teams. So a bit of a roundabout way, but it's been a really interesting journey, and I'm really excited about the future.
That's pretty cool. So that transition and seeing how training or the education component affects the employees and their output and their changes really relates very heavily back into sort of the digital transformation world. And digital transformation is a very broad topic. So how would you define digital transformation in the modern enterprise?
I think it's a great question. And I think you ask 5 people that are experts in this, you'll get 5 different answers. I view digital transformation in the form of almost like we're on probably the 3rd or 4th wave here. The first wave was probably in the 80s and 90s where things were being digitized for the first time. And then all of a sudden it was the internet comes into play. And then it was cloud technologies, wave 3. And I think this 4th wave is almost the most difficult to pin down because people will say it's going to be AI or it's going to be this or that. And the way that I think about it is I view this wave that we're in right now as almost the consumerization of the enterprise experience. And what I mean by that is you've got a huge number of people that are entering the workforce that have never known life without a computer. Even myself, I'm just turned 40 a couple of years ago. There was about an 8 or 9 year period there where computers weren't a thing, and probably another decade where I didn't have one of my own and so forth. But this new wave of people that are coming in, they have high expectations, and they're using things like Discord and various Instagram, whatever apps that are really polished, highly consumerized, have had hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D put behind them. And then they walk into the enterprise space and it's, oh dear God, it's what is this software? Why is it difficult to use? Why can't it be like what I've got on my phone right now in my personal life? And I think that gap is going to provide increasing pressure on large enterprise organizations to bring their systems up to the quality that people are just de facto expecting. And I think that is going to be probably almost more changed in the previous few waves combined. I think that's good for companies like ourselves. And there are many of them that kind of believe that enterprise software doesn't have to suck. But I think it's going to put a huge amount of pressure on those that are in charge of those systems because this stuff is complicated and the landscape is very challenging. But I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be interesting through that wave.
It's interesting you brought up the consumerization and then related it directly to the employee experience, because we often hear about, we're going to create this great app for our customers, right? And they've spent all this time, a customer facing app, yet all of the internal applications and interfaces are all these more legacy or seasoned heritage applications. I'm trying to say it without saying they suck, but the fact is that these very old platforms that have been around for a while have been doing their job the way they were designed to, or have been refined to do that job even better. But the fact is that they're still difficult to work with from an employee experience perspective. And now, as you mentioned, we have this new wave of folks coming in for Gen X folks, millennials, later millennials. Again, you mentioned this is something that we grew up with and dealt with. But for the folks who are earlier millennials, Gen Z folks who are coming into the workforce, they've always had an iPhone in their pocket. So they're trying to figure out what the heck to do with this application, right? And from that perspective, you got a healthy tension between the employees who are looking to make a difference, looking to do something for your organization, and then this tension of, but I have to get past this interface issue that I'm dealing with. So you see those different things as you know, but it's all from an employee perspective. I thought it was a very interesting way of viewing that.
Yeah, I think they're linked, aren't they? And that compounds the problem. You get, like you said, you get the customer experience solved and everybody's celebrating and your employees are still very frustrated, or you get that solved and your customers are left out in the dark. And then you've got partners, or maybe you operate a franchise model and you've got to service those, which are slightly different customers. And I think what we have seen is that there have been really good attempts to solve those challenges, but they're usually isolated, right? It's the customer, you have the customer training team, they have the in-house employee team and the franchise team or whatever. And I think that approach can work. And we've seen some people be very successful in that, but you're still getting to that problem where those are now 3 silos and the CEO is asking, where is my training budget going? Or the CFO is asking, what am I getting for this? And to answer that, now you've got to go to 3 different places, and the answer is probably murky as a result of that. And so what I advocate for, and what increasingly I think is the solution, and this has only come through 10 years of working in this space and really learning from our customers, is that I believe that the key thing to nail, the bit of the iceberg that's under, the biggest bit of the iceberg that's under the water, and the most important, is to get that operational infrastructure in place and then take a step back and think about, maybe we can provide 3 different veneers or views into this infrastructure based on whether they're a customer, an employee, or a partner. And maybe the organization needs to own that look and feel themselves. And now we're getting really technical and all this stuff, but increasingly what we find is companies are coming to the realization that they want to control that bit that matters most to them, which is that user experience. They don't want to have to build a bunch of stuff from scratch, but they do want to find a platform that they can leverage. And the buzzword for techies is headless architecture. And what we have seen is that is increasingly of heavy interest from our customers. We have student-facing stuff that they can use, but immediately they want to customize it, or they want to, what we call, expand the learning surface area, and they want to put a learner engagement piece in an area or a system or a piece of their product that we're never going to ship as a feature, but they can. And so having a rich infrastructure and a set of APIs that your tech team can hit against and deliver those things I think is the way to solve this very difficult problem of how do we engage people at the right level at the right time.
I think that's a good approach in terms of offering your end customers the ability to do that. As we look at the end customers and their employees, they're seeing those roles are changing. So you bring in new technology. There's the legacy technology they may have used for quite some time. Perhaps they are a Gen X or maybe even a boomer. And I hate to be using these terms, but it gives us a kind of viewpoint of sort of an experiential viewpoint where, hey, I've been using the software for the past X number of years and I know it's quirky, but I know how to use it, right? I understand it. Versus the direct conflict from folks coming in out of college or being hired in who may never have experienced that software and think it's not just quirky, it's clunky, and it's preventing me from doing my jobs. This whole concept of like, we're going to do a digital transformation program. We're going to make this fresh, new, whatever. And we're going to bring these things together. We're going to buy the $700 trillion platform from the mega huge organization that does this at other mega huge organizations. And we're going to apply that. And that's going to be the answer. But we also know is that when you look at digital transformation, I've seen a few different ways that people approach this. One of them is they look at like a proof of concept. We're going to wait for the proof that digital success is here and this is actually going to work. So we'll do this one step at a time. I'll dip my toe in and I'll see if I can do it. Or they may look at it as we need to put a plan, like a multi-year plan in place and look at it from every possible angle before we actually start on to make sure we get it right. And then finally, there's more of an incremental, what I call agile way of approaching that. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are, I think what is really required is a combination of all three. And what I mean by that is I really believe that leaders need to come forward and present bold goals and say, we need X million dollars over the next 5 years to get these 3 or 4 really measurable, really clear outcomes. And I think it's relatively straightforward to put that together at a high level, but where organizations tend to run aground is then they really box themselves in by maybe over planning over the next 5 years, or it becomes very rigid. And so what we advocate for is look for a specific type of partner that understands that we need to construct an ecosystem here to solve many different problems and really solve many different challenges. And the challenges that we're solving today are not going to be the ones we're going to have tomorrow. And we don't even know the 32 that we're going to have over the next 3 to 5 years. And as a vendor, we hate proof of concepts because we feel like you just need to burn the ship sometimes when you're going and invading a place and you really commit, right? But I do get it. And as a CIO, I sometimes demanded that we need a proof of concept. But I think what we're really talking about is the ability to make bets that are relatively small and see them pay off, and then go on to the next bet that you make and see it pay off, or it fails and that's fine and you move on. But there needs to be this underlying, and I keep using this word, infrastructure, where you need to find a partner that can provide you. If you've ever heard of the company Twilio, they don't provide you a phone system. They provide you the tools to build a phone system that works for your organization. I think increasingly that's what we advocate for, because again, referring back to ForgeRock, they became our customer when they just raised their Series A. There were 2 people on the training team, and I think 40 to 50 people total at the company. And today they're a public company. That's 8 or 9 years later, rocket ship ride. And the needs of ForgeRock today are completely different from the needs of ForgeRock 8 to 9 to 10 years ago. But by investing in infrastructure like Administrate, they were able to do things like, let's start with SurveyMonkey to poll our students and see how that things worked. And then they got a little bit more enterprise and they switched to SurveyGizmo. And then they got a little bit more enterprise and now they're using Qualtrics. And they were able to mix and match and swap these tools in and out and use the right tool for the right job because they had a platform that they could plug things into. And so for me, it's once you get that bedrock infrastructure in place, then you can figure out what other systems and things and projects that you need to do. And you can make those bets and you can do them with confidence that they'll either fail within a couple of months or they'll succeed and you'll move on to the next thing. Meanwhile, you're continuously tracking towards that 5-year plan or 7-year, whatever it is that you get somebody to sign off budget for. And I think that's where we've seen a ton of success when you've got that high visionary component combined with that willingness to make those bets and see them not pay off and see them pay off and then double down. So a bit of a maybe fence straddling answer, but I think it works.
Yeah, I think we've seen something similar where we see a big thought. So we have a long range plan thought. We think big about these things. The customer understands that we want to go into this because we see the long term benefit for it. I thought you brought up a really good point with your customer, and that is 6 years into whatever you're doing, the world changes. AI between 2022 and 2023 changed dramatically with the introduction of the unveiling of OpenAI and the excitement that goes around that. And now we have tons of new large language model things that just appeared on the horizon, right? That if you were planning in 2020 during the pandemic, it's unlikely you would have seen that as a potential that you need to worry about in 3 years from now in terms of how you were managing your organization. So long range plans have to be a little less prescriptive, but a lot more endpoint focused. Where do we want to end up in 5 years? We may get there with different technologies, but the idea is that we know where we're headed, and that way everyone in the organization can row in the same direction, get you to the same place then.
Yeah, I think AI is probably one of the best examples we'll see in our lifetimes of how chaotic and unpredictable this can be, because it's every 2 to 3 weeks, there's like some new tool to do what I thought was tools doing a great job of 3 to 6 weeks ago. And again, like if we were to find 10 experts on the best tools for whatever, we'd all come up with different answers. And I think that is an opportunity, but only if you've got that bedrock infrastructure in place that lets you experiment, mix and match quickly. And it's actually it haunts me to think of the cost of not having that stuff in place, because you could make a big bet on a clear front runner and a clear winner and an obvious solution today that literally in 6 to 9 months, you're getting laughed out of the room for having done that. And that's a scary position to be in. I don't care if you're working at a big company or a small company. It's just wild out there. It's the Wild West, big time.
I would definitely agree with that. So we look at, again, back to the whole concept of digital transformation. It implies changes in a number of different ways. One, maybe the process changes, where perhaps you apply automation or whatever with it. The business changes, where we have new offerings or maybe even new business areas that we focus on. And certainly the concept that you mentioned of technology is always changing throughout all of these things here. So to your point you just made, how does an organization successfully navigate all these moving parts when you have a process changing, the business model changing, and then technology that's a turbulent wave throughout that?
Yeah, I think training is probably the largest component of that, right? And unfortunately, that usually means for most training teams that are classically positioned, a lot more work, a lot more money required, a lot more time, and it's really tough, right? The last thing a training team wants to hear sometimes is, hey, we just bought a new company or we're launching this new product. We need to go out and build out 10 weeks of training that everybody in the company is going to have to go through. That is stressful and really difficult because they're trying to just keep afloat as it is usually. But that is the reason, right? But I think what's missing is we so seldomly find that training teams have successfully integrated the training activities and goals that they have, measured up and married them up with a business metric that the organization cares about. And I'll give you an example that where we screwed this up from our own company, right? We're a software company and we launched Administrate University about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's to train our customers on our own products, right? Customer training. And some would say, why'd you wait so long? Just wait. But basically what happened was we launched Administrate University and it's running on Administrate, of course. And the person responsible, the VP, comes in after the first week or two and they're like, great news. We've had 50 customers go through this and 100 students and all this stuff. And it's exceeded our expectations by 30%. And everybody's on Slack, our internal messaging tool. And they're like, hooray. And everybody's like, celebration emoji and beer emoji and whatever, right? And it's like, that was great. And then the next week they come in and they do it again. And we like even more emojis. And then a week after that, they came in and said, hey, we've hooked up Administrate to Zendesk, which is our ticketing solution, and also does our NPS, our Net Promoter Score calculations. And they said, what we found is that every customer that has successfully gone through Administrate University and become certified their support ticket volume has gone down by half and their NPS has gone up by 20 points. And I was like, what? And immediately that minute, we doubled the budget on that program, right? And that meant that we didn't have to hire as many support people down the line. And it meant we had happier, more successful customers. And it was like this mind-blowing moment because a metric that I really cared about, the whole company really cared about, was dramatically moved by the training team, and they could demonstrate that. And man, we threw so much money at that so fast, and it paid off so amazingly well. And that's what we want to see. But you can't have that conversation by just saying 9 out of 10 of the people that completed this training activity thought it was great, or it just nobody cares, right? In the nicest possible way. But when we can tie that actionable business metric to a training activity, then we can really move mountains. And that's what we want to see.
So going back to your end customers who were experiencing this training and being able to move that forward, when you look at a non-training environment, when you look at the actual, what they're trying to accomplish in a manufacturer, in a bank, in an insurance company, roles are changing all the time. So we have this concept where, hey, they're running their digital transformation programs. Stuff is changing. So we have to teach people about what is changing, what our expectations are for their roles. When you look at the broader definition of this transformational effort, how often is it that we're seeing that training is an afterthought versus a baked in part of that transformation?
I think training is constantly an afterthought. And I think the reason for that is, again, you can't demonstrate how a metric moves. We have a customer, Boston Whaler, speaking of manufacturing, they were one of the early customers that we started to get that itch in our brain that actually this is super, super important. They had a great team there and they had a problem. They wanted to double the output of their factory and the physical size of their factory within 18 months. It's a pretty big, they make boats, right? Pretty big factory in North Florida, not in Boston of all places. And what they did is they hooked Administrate up to their manufacturing resource planning, their assembly line software. And what they could then do is they could see every day, every hour, I think is an hourly feed. Here's where the mistakes were made putting together a boat. And here's the people that were on the line at that time. And then they could contrast that with the training records and they could see Mike over there was a year out of date on their certification, or John had never been certified for this model, but got pulled on the line and just said, do some fiberglass, whatever. And so what happened was, not in a punitive way, but they started going in and the training team was in the forefront of making these interventions of, hey, we saw that there was a mistake made. We want to help you fix it and retrain you. And they even found where some instructors were training people wrong. And so there's a pattern there that they could find. And those interventions did two things, right? And the first one makes sense, right? It reduced their manufacturing errors, and that's worth millions and millions, particularly in a fast-growing factory like Boston Whaler. But the second one kind of blew my mind, actually, which was the HR team was adamant that we reduce their involuntary employee turnover. And what he said was, he said, people by and large knew when they were making a mistake, right? They installed the propeller and it turns the wrong way or whatever. And so they just knew that they had made a mistake. But what happened was they would make that same mistake a couple of times. And then they'd be like, I'm going to get fired. And they would just quit. And so they said some of the best people with the highest throughput were making the most mistakes because they were working really hard and they would quit. But when the training team came and said, hey, we see you making a mistake and we're going to make sure you get extra time to do this and practice this, all of a sudden, and this is normal, all of a sudden it flipped that conversation into, oh, cool, the organization is helping me get better at my job. Training got valued more. People listened when the training team came. The training team was excited because they could see the impact that they were having. HR was like, wow, we've seen sometimes, unfortunately, training teams and HR can go head to head for budget or whatever, but everybody was like lined up behind this goal. And that's what it was just a really satisfying experience. And that was one of the early examples that we saw of the power that you can have just by simply knitting together two systems that are traditionally siloed.
So you mentioned an interesting point about targeting sort of the involuntary departures or maybe the voluntary departures depending on how they're looking at it. If you're seeing training have that impact on quality, et cetera, how do you transition that into maybe changing culture, as well as perhaps drawing people towards something. You mentioned before, hey, it's training's an afterthought and we bolted on to help folks to get stuff on there. But if you look at it maybe in a different way, during a digital transformation, perhaps that's the best time to help train people on that endpoint to help draw them towards it. Can you contrast those?
Yeah, I think when people start to see that training can help them achieve their goals and do better at their jobs in a tangible way, all of a sudden things get pretty exciting, right? It moves, and we're seeing this more and more, that there's this real desire to move from a push model, which is the classic one that we've all experienced probably, where training teams are pushing people towards the next training, and all these nag emails are going out and people are getting annoyed on both ends. And the boss is like sitting there thinking, I don't want to have to stick everybody in an all day training about whatever, because it's not going to do anything. And it's just a mess. And I think when you can surface this idea that, hey, we see that our business goal or organizational goal is not being met, or we're not meeting it as well as we could, let's do some training. And then all of a sudden things improve. People get into a pull mentality and they start badgering the training team. Hey, can you train me more? Or can we learn about this? Or can I go do that? And that's just a wonderful spot to be in, because it just becomes a flywheel, a self-referencing thing where we train more, we get better. We want more training, we get even better. And I think that folks love to learn deep down, but if you think back to a frustrating learning experience that you had, it's probably because you haven't felt ultimately like it would help you in a tangible, meaningful way. And so that, unfortunately though, when we talk about training, you go to conferences or whatever, folks are mired in the land of activity metrics. And it's because it's all we have. It's nobody's fault, but we're sitting there and we're like 85% gave us 2 thumbs up on that training. We don't have the answer to what percentage did a better job over the next 6 months. And that's what really matters. So it's nobody's fault that we're here, but I think solving that problem is the really big, hairy goal that training leaders need to have, because it helps not only for the training function and the business goal of today, but it helps whenever you need to do that organizational change like you're referencing. And that's going to just be required many times over the next, forever. That's the only constant, right? Is change.
So let's talk about that for keep on talking, because I think it's an important part of the whole discussion, which is training can build up the resources in your organization to have the viewpoints that you're trying to build into your ultimate workforce. So if the CEO is thinking about this and our executive team is thinking about this and saying, if we were to do X, or that could take their experience in insurance, that we've had all these very tenured people who really understand insurance, but they're so used to doing things the current way. And I actually want them done a different way, because we can't compete in this market unless we change. Yet I have this very well-established workforce that is happy doing what they're doing. Maybe they don't see the benefits of going there. So training can be used as a communications tool to help guide that vision from the top down. But also, it looks like you mentioned before, it's required. The change is always going to be there. How do you draw folks into that to say, I want to move forward in this? Is it possible that you have a metric that is looking at the role changes from within your organization as a success metric?
Yeah, I think if you've got a training goal that is not tied to an organizational metric, then it's probably not going to work, right? It's probably going to fail. And there's a bunch of layers of complexity here, right? The stupid example I often use is CEO of large organization X, right? What if you wanted everybody to read the same blog post or whatever it is, like just the simplest thing in your company? How could you make that happen? And how could you see whether people were doing it? And the answer is that's often actually super complicated and very difficult. Might have to be translated in 5 different languages. And there's a whole bunch of complexity there. And the systems and stuff just probably don't exist. That's a very simple example, but I think it's just about we got to build a culture of really just understanding how to move these business metrics. One thing is to just do the work required, right? But the second piece of it is we've got to incorporate training as this like just day-to-day muscle, organizational muscle that is a core competency, because that change thing, we can't do anything about that. And we've got work that we need to get done, but that's changing all the time. And so the way to combat that and the way to get over that and to really to differentiate and really win out there in the market is to make sure that the team is pulling in the same direction as much as possible in the best way possible. And so far, the silver bullet that we've found happens to be training. The challenges are in the delivery and the measurement of that.
And what's interesting is that through all this concept of digital transformation, technology, wave changes and such, the most common and most effective way of approaching that is actually through the changing of a human, which cuts back to something that's fairly straightforward, which is how to provide them the information they need and the inspiration they need to make that transition.
Yeah, 100%. I get asked sometimes, do we have any IP or patents or whatever? And I'm like, no, we don't have any of that. And like all we have, right now, we were moving offices during the pandemic and that kind of got canceled. And so we don't have an office, right? We got some monitors and desks in a storage facility somewhere. Literally all we have are a bunch of people pulling in the right direction, hopefully every day. And it's weird when you think about it, but yeah, that it's very ephemeral. What is an organization? What is a business? It's not anything other than just humans going for something. And that's what I think everybody says. You overestimate what you can get done in a year, but you underestimate what you can get done in a decade. And you could probably apply that to a bunch of different timeframes, probably a month and a year and so forth. I think it's just, that's the challenge and that's the thing to overcome. That's the biggest challenge for any organization, how to get everybody aligned and moving together. And we've seen that. I've seen that in the businesses I've been involved in. It's easy to align 5, 6, 10 people. That one of my companies, I hired a bunch of folks I went to college with, and turns out that when you go to college in Indiana, that's a lot of white guys that are all about the same age. And it's easy to align those folks. But when you start thinking about what's a global enterprise need to look like, you've got people from all different backgrounds and ethnicities, and the differences are just huge. And so getting people to align becomes much more difficult. But yeah, I think we've found it certainly in our business, and we found that those customers of ours that are performing best, it's because they have this culture and this muscle memory of just training as a core piece and a differentiator for their business.
It sounds like they're planning for the change.
Yeah, absolutely. And they don't know what it looks like, but they're there and they're ready to go. And then the pandemic hits, and the ones that were set up, it was difficult, it's scary, but we managed to flip some switches and everything went online and virtual. And the ones that didn't plan were really struggling, unfortunately.
I bet. Okay, switching gears here. Do you read?
Yeah, I love to read. I don't read as much as I would want, but yeah, I really love reading.
So
my Kindle is always with me.
I was going to ask you, if I was to look on your Kindle right now, what books would you be reading at this moment?
All right. So I'm funny. I tend to read a few books at the same time, which drives some people nuts, but I like to read fiction. I really like to read business books, although I feel like a lot of them could be condensed down into a pamphlet, but I think there's still value in ruminating as you're going through. I think this bit right now where I've read like 2 or 3 straight books on about video games, because I love video games and they're a big part of my childhood and so forth. I've just finished John Romero, who's the creator of Doom and Keen and Quake. He wrote a book. He actually spoke at our user conference a few years ago, which was a highlight of like my life. But he's really entertaining about games, inventing the first person shooter genre. And then I'm reading one now about a number of different games and how they were made. And I think what's interesting is that very creative process of making a video game, which multidisciplinary and takes a lot of effort and so forth, is there's no straight line. Just like in our day-to-day jobs, there's just no straight line of this creative work. So it's been really interesting. And I've also reading a few books about football, or
Okay.
as we say in the
Yeah,
States,
soccer.
soccer, right? And I've recently gotten really into that. There's a load of books that talk about the application of analytics and kind of Moneyball, really, but for football
Mm-hmm.
/ soccer. And I remember I heard a really great talk by the head of analytics at Liverpool Football Club. And he's a PhD in astrophysics, I think, and a lifelong Liverpool fan. But yeah, that's a very results-driven business as well. And there's a lot of training that goes on. In fact, we call practice here in the UK training, right? We're going to go out and train as a team. And it thinking, like you said, taking lessons from the sports world and maybe from the video game world and business world and kind of mash it all together. There's a lot of common themes, and it just helps you think of a problem from a different angle sometimes.
And you're not putting on gym shoes, you put on trainers. So
That's right. Exactly.
The concept of training is definitely something that's built into the sports world in the way that you approach it. And maybe the business world has some thinking to do about that. Interesting concept.
Yeah.
Interesting
Yeah.
concept. Great approach that way. It was great talking with you about this stuff. I really appreciate your perspectives on training and the fact that digital transformation is not just all about the technology. It's more about the people and getting those people engaged. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today on our podcast, because this is really a great way of reviewing what's important on our people side as we look at our digital transformation program. So thank you for joining us.
I really appreciated the time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.